Fighting in Africa started with the Italian declaration of war on June 10, 1940. Fighting for Africa dates back to the era of colonies and the scramble of Africa between 1981 and 1914. Egypt being a protectorate of the British, there was a big British presence in North Africa. On June 14th, 4 days after the declaration of war, the British 11th Hussars crossed the border into Libya and captured the Italian Fort Capuzzo. The Italians supplemented this with an offensive into Egypt and captured Sidi Barrani in September of 1940. As a counter to this, the British launched Operation Compass, in which the Italian 10th Army was destroyed and 130,000 prisoners of war were taken. This also led to the German Afrika Korps, which was ordered into North Africa, led by the famous General Erwin Rommel, to help reinforce the Italian armies through the launch of Operation Sonnenblume. With orders to reinforce the Italian army and prevent a full Axis defeat, a series of battles over the course of a year were most notably for possession of Tobruk and Tripoli ensued, eventually climaxing in 1942 with the Second Battle of El Alamein, where through the leadership of British General Bernard Montgomery dealt the Axis a decisive defeat, pushing them back to Tunisia. Following this defeat, the Axis didn't go on the offensive in North Africa again. The year 1942 was a disastrous year for the Axis all over, with defeats in North Africa, the U.S. entering the war, and on the east, Operation Barbarossa. The year 1942 was a disastrous year for the Axis all over, with defeats in North Africa, the U.S. entering the war, and on the east, Operation Barbarossa. 1942 was truly a turning point in the war. With Axis forces needed on the Eastern Front, they somewhat provided relief for the Allies. Then, on November 8, 1942, the Allies, with the help of the U.S., launched Operation Torch, led by U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower. Torch lasted from 8th to 11th of November, and was an invasion of French North Africa. With 125,000 Vichy French soldiers, 210 out-of-date tanks, and 500 airplanes, the Allies expected the fighting to be easy or non-existent. The Allies planned a three-pronged attack, with a task force aimed at Casablanca, Oran, and a third aimed at Algiers, led by the U.S. 34th Infantry and one brigade of the British 78th. The only fighting occurred in the port of Algiers. As the Allies gained control, the successful operation allowed Allies to get much-needed reinforcements and push towards Tunisia, where, after being circled by the Allies, the Axis surrendered by May 13, 1943, yielding over 275 prisoners of war. This loss of troops over a quick period of time greatly reduced the Axis military capabilities. The Axis defeat led to all Italian-held colonies in Africa to be captured, and due to the victory, North Africa allowed the Allies to invade Europe through the boot of Italy, with the invasion of Sicily beginning 2 months after the Axis surrender in Africa.
The first part of the invasion of the Western Front was when the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. This one is known to the Germans as Operation Weserübung. This German invasion began on April 9, 1940, when Germany invaded both Denmark and Norway. This was important because the British and French were planning to occupy both of these countries because they believed the Germans would eventually go for them. Denmark was critical to the Germans in a larger sense to set up their invasion of Norway. Within hours of the German invasion of Denmark, Cecil von Rontfink, a German ambassador, called Peter Munch, the Prime Minister of Denmark, and threatened that unless the Danish surrendered immediately, the Germans would bomb Copenhagen, the capital. Munch obliged, and a couple hours later the Germans took control of Denmark. Immediately following this victory, Germans air troopers landed and secured airfields in Norway. However, a German landing in Oslo was defeated when the cruiser Blücher was sunk. However, more German ships came with supplies. The Allies were unprepared for this and quickly attempted to put together a counterattack. However, they were of no help, as the Germans quickly marched through the country and King Håkon VII of Norway quickly left as Norway ended up surrendering a month later. The next major battle was the Battle of France in 1940. Even though the war between the Allies and Axis powers started on September 1, 1939, the only military activity had really been in Denmark and Norway. Before this time, the war had been coined as the Phony War. However, on May 10, 1940, the Nazis invaded France. By June 5th, Germany had outflanked the Maginot Line and soon moved their way deep into France. Just over a week later, on June 14th, Paris was taken, and on June 25th, France became part of the Axis powers. The Battle of Belgium began on the same day as the Battle of France, May 10th, 1940. This began with the Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, invading Belgium. France decided to put their best forces in Belgium as they believed it would be the best way to stop the German push. However, the Germans ended up going in through the Ardennes and they advanced in the direction of the English Channel. In just 5 days, the army made it to the Channel and surrounded the Allies. The Germans continued to push the Allies back, and on May 28th, the Belgians surrendered. Following the defeats of the French and the Belgians, it was inevitable that the Germans would invade Britain. They finally invaded on July 10th of 1940. The Battle of Britain was unique in the fact that it was a totally air-fought war. The British were led by Air Marshal Hugh Dowding. The Germans began the push by battling in the English Channel. However, Dowding didn't commit the whole RAF towards this, as this is what the Germans wished they would do. The British only lost 96 aircrafts, while the Germans lost 226 in the month following this. However, the main part of the battle began on August 13th when the Germans began to bomb the RAF airfields. While it looked like the Germans would take care of the Brits, they for some reason decided to switch their bombings from the RAF to London. This was a crucial mistake as they couldn't finish off the British military when they had them where they wanted, and this eventually led to Britain winning the battle. Even with this loss, Germany still had control of much of Europe. However, the Allies began pushing back with the D-Day invasion. This surprise invasion occurred on June 6, 1944, in the Normandy region of France. It was known as Operation Overlord. The Allies began this invasion by tricking the Germans into thinking the invasion would be at another location and later in the year. Therefore, when the Allies stormed the Normandy beaches, the Germans weren't ready for them. The Allies stormed the beaches codenamed Omaha, Gold, Utah, Juno, and Sword. While the Allies lost 7,000 more lives than the Axis powers, the Allies were prepared with 3 times as many soldiers as the Germans, and this made it a decisive victory for the Allies. This was seen as a turning point for the war, as after this victory, the rest of the war was the Allies pushing the Germans back, eventually into defeat. The final major battle on the Western Front was the Battle of the Bulge. This took place in the heavily wooded Ardennes Forest region of southern Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The surprise German offensive took place between the cities of Monschau in the north and Trier in the south. This battle took place from December 1944 to January 1945. This was seen as Germany's last push towards peace. The goal of this battle was to split the British and American army in two, capture supplies, and negotiate a peace settlement. When the Germans began their attack, it was very successful. The American and British militants were very surprised and many of the troops were inexperienced. However, with a combination of winter weather, fierce fighting, rough terrain, superior Allied air power, the offensive was eventually contained around December 25th, and the Germans were forced to retreat.
The Eastern Front was a critical portion of World War II and involved the war between Germany and the Soviet Union. It was predicated on Hitler's deep-seated hatred of the communists, as well as his need for the food that the fertile land of the Ukraine could provide and the oil that the land near the Caucasus contained. The German offensive into Russia was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. The offensive, like all German offensives in World War II, was based on the Blitzkrieg model, in which German bombers swept in ahead of mechanized divisions comprised of tanks, which were followed by foot soldiers or infantry divisions. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German army was met with very little resistance. However, when their panzer division split up to take 2 targets, Leningrad and the Ukraine, simultaneously, the main German infantry division was forced to advance slowly towards Moscow. Hitler and his generals debated fiercely over this decision. His generals advocated moving all army groups to attack Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union and the most major communications hub in the country. Hitler instead refused to listen to this reasoning. On September 30th, however, Hitler changed his mind again, displaying the erratic tendencies that would come to define him as a military commander, and ordered the 2 panzer divisions to move on Moscow. This delay wasted the summer for the German military, and left them attacking their primary objectives as fall. The mud season for Russia began. Towards the end of October, the Germans began their siege on Leningrad, and by the middle of November they began their assault on Moscow. Unfortunately for the Germans, the time that had been wasted over the summer had allowed the Russians to mass their strength and bring reinforcements from eastern Russia. On December 5th, the Soviets, led by Marshal Zhukov, pushed the Germans away from Moscow for good.
The Germans then focused on attacking Stalingrad, a strong point that held a vast amount of oil critical to the continued operation of German tanks and planes. The battle for Stalingrad was the most costly battle in World War II, claiming more than 2 million lives, many of which were civilians. Stalin issued Order 231 at the beginning of the attack in July 1942, the famous "not a step back" order. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in Operation Uranus, which began on November 19, 1942, and was the Soviet counterattack that destroyed the German Sixth Army, its linchpin on the Eastern Front. After this major turning point, the Germans proceeded to lose the battle for Kursk as well, and the Soviet offensive began to take true shape in the winter of 1943. By November of 1943, the Red Army had already captured Kiev, and by the summer of 1944 they had pushed to within 250 miles of Berlin, and outnumbered Germans at a 6-to-1 ratio. After the Bagration offensive ended in March 1945, the Red Army was a mere 50 kilometers away from Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin, and 3 days later, the defense commander of Berlin surrendered the city to the Red Army and Stalin. On May 7, 1945, the German Chief of Staff signed the documents for the unconditional surrender of Germany and its armies to the Allies.